There we are. All right. Good evening, everyone. I see it's about 5 to the hour. We're just going to wait a few minutes to get started. I just wanted to make sure that we've got our tech working, set everything up accurately to make sure that we're good to go. You can hear me all right. Is that right, Casey?
Yeah, you're coming in clear.
I see a thumbs up from Chantel there too, so that's good news. How's it going, boss? We'll start having people come in here over the next 5 minutes. We'll get started shortly after the hour. But for those of you as you're logging in, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat panel or the Q&A section. We will make sure that we get to them as we go along. We've got a pretty big attendee list tonight. I think we have about 100 people registered for tonight. So we'll have a pretty good sized audience. And that being said, I encourage as many questions, comments, responses to the content as you feel comfortable providing. And again, we'll start in about 4 minutes. All right, it looks like our audience is starting to pour in now. So good evening, my attendees, welcome. It's great to see you all. I know we're going to have many more people logging in here over the next couple of minutes. So I will start a little bit slowly tonight, just to give our audience time to get in and get settled in. So welcome. My name is Steve Keller. I am the project developer and national speaker for Drug Free Kids Canada. We will be chatting a little bit about the nature of DFK when we start up the presentation, as well as focusing on 3 specific substances for the next 90 minutes, those being alcohol, cannabis, as well as nicotine products. So for that, we're going to speak about tobacco, and we're also going to speak about vaping. But we will segment each into its own category. We'll have some discussion about how they interact with each other, some of the discussions around mixing substances. But really what we're going to be focusing on tonight, and as our audience logs in, you're going to see this over the next few slides, we're going to be focusing on a great deal of data, information, and trends on substance use, especially with youth. But what we're going to do is we're going to apply that information to effective and non-judgmental dialogue with the young people in our lives, whether that's our kids, whether that's our clients, whether that's our students, whether that is the young people in our communities. Our role here at Drug Free Kids is to empower parents to have these discussions and to offer support where they can and where it is necessary to make sure that youth can live a healthy and safe lifestyle. So, see, it's about a minute or two there past the hour, and so I will start moving in. I think we can get started. Casey, what do you think? Do you want to wait a moment or should we get going?
I think you should get going.
All right, we'll let the audience come in as we start up. So what is our vision at DFK? Sometimes when we do presentations on substance use, people hear our title and they may believe that we're promoting sort of an abstinence-only approach or just say no approach. And that's not quite the truth. Our vision is to ensure that young people are able to live their lives free of problematic substance use and addiction. We understand and we acknowledge that substance use is a choice. People may use drugs for a wide array of reasons, and we may not be able to stop every single person from using substances. But if we can set a realistic goal of encouraging them to understand the risks, the potential complications that can arise from drug use as well as alcohol use, and promote strategies and skills that can reduce the possibility of harms, then we actually sort of guide youth towards a healthier lifestyle. And it's really a matter of trying to lower the risk. And that's why we talk about living life free of problematic substance use, as opposed to just saying living free of all substances. Because as we will see tonight, substance use can't really be seen in sort of a negative or positive only light. We need to take a neutral approach to this conversation and the subject matter, and we will do that as we explore the different drugs that we are discussing this evening. Now, I would like to acknowledge some of the services that Drug Free Kids offer. These include our website. Many of you who are joining us tonight, as you're logging in, you would have registered through our website on drugfreekidscanada.org. We'll put a link in the chat panel here in the next few moments if you haven't seen it, although I think most people registered through the website, so I feel like you're fairly familiar. We offer various resources, including talk kits, substance use at a glance series, which you'll see in just a moment, as well as direct links to our parent support hub and particular substances. If you have any questions about whether that's vaping, whether that's tobacco, whether that's alcohol, whether that's cannabis, whether that's hallucinogens, whether that's stimulants, you can find many of these sort of different substances and more on our website, drugfreekidscanada.org. We offer resources for parents and adults involved in the lives of youth. These include our Cannabis Talk Toolkit, as well as our Opioid Talk Toolkit. You will also find resources for parents on having non-judgmental dialogue around alcohol and vaping on our website. Over the last several months, we've also begun releasing and will continue to release our Substances at a Glance series. Currently, you can find resources on the site about alcohol, opioids, cannabis, and vaping from this series. However, in the coming weeks, we will be adding resources on methamphetamine, as well as cocaine, sedatives, other stimulants. We've also got pieces coming out on psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, ketamine, anabolic steroids, as well as designer drugs, and a few others who currently escape me at the moment. We have our Let's Talk Drug series, which you're seeing tonight. These are 60 to 90-minute free workshops offered regionally as well as nationally, examining substance use, risk, harm reduction, and discussion strategies for supporting youth. So marrying that data, that research, those studies, those national surveys, to the strategies that we can use when engaging with young people about substance use. You're going to learn about that tonight. We have our Parent Support Hub, which I will make sure to explore in greater detail at the end of the presentation, as this is a virtual space for parents, guardians, and families to receive guidance and support around substance use. And as many of you are likely familiar, DFK has been promoting and offering awareness-raising campaigns for a number of years. Perhaps you've seen our public service announcements on TV, heard them on the radio, or seen them on social media. Drug Free Kids has long had a presence in media, and more recently, we've aimed to sort of establish a greater presence in connecting directly with community. And that's why I said, for those of you that logged in early, and for those of you that are coming in just now, we encourage you, if you have questions, to pop them into the chat panel, to stick them into the Q&A. We want to engage. We want to know, is there something that you'd like us to expand on further? Is there something that we've missed? Is there a question that maybe you haven't seen us touch on? If there are any, don't hesitate to ask. Now, I am going to acknowledge two things. First, I'm going to acknowledge the resources from where we collected a great deal of the data tonight. These include various resources from Health and Stats Canada, including the Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol, and Drug Survey, as well as the Canadian Alcohol and Drug, Tobacco and Nicotine, Cannabis, and the Post-Secondary Alcohol and Drug Surveys. So when we're doing acknowledgements here, we're acknowledging resources, as well as much of the research that you've seen from our Cannabis Talk Kit, our Youth and Alcohol, and Youth and Vaping sections. You will also find resources in this presentation that have been sourced from CAMH, as well as the CCSA and CMHA, among others. But while we're on the topic of acknowledgement, I do want to acknowledge, of course, where it is I'm presenting tonight, which is a nice, brisk, cool Peterborough, Ontario. upon territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, adjacent to the Haudenosaunee territory. And I do like to do a bit of a land acknowledgement in this presentation, especially for a national audience, because this is a region that I've grown up in. Not just that I work here professionally, but I grew up in Belleville, which is about an hour and a half away from Peterborough. I spent a great deal of time as a youth on the First Nation territory of Tyendinaga. As I got older, I spent time visiting with friends in Curve Lake. During my time working my last couple of positions over the last number of years, I've had partnerships with Hiawatha First Nation, as well as Alderville and Curve Lake First Nation, all of which are around Peterborough. And I do acknowledge with a great deal of respect and admiration the strength and vibrant communities with whom I've been able to work. And I encourage those listening tonight to take the time and engage with your Indigenous partners, with your Indigenous communities around you, to really learn more about the land. And not only that, but learn more about the teachings that can help inform knowledge like what we see tonight. Let's get into this presentation, shall we? We said we were going to talk about cannabis. We said we were going to talk about alcohol. We said we were going to talk about nicotine. You'll see I have a term up here for vaping. Now, before I start the actual discussion of data, it helps that we have sort of an operational definition or an idea of what does the term mean of each one of these. So first, if I ask you about cannabis, and I'm going to turn this to the audience, you can put your response in the chat panel, pop it into the question and answer. What do you know about cannabis? When you hear that term, what do you think of? Really the first thing that comes to mind. There's no wrong answer here. What do we think? Well, while you're thinking, I'm going to pop up a little definition here on the board. We know that cannabis is a plant, natural, which contains hundreds of chemicals which are known as cannabinoids. Another word for weed in the vernacular, you may have also heard it referred to as marijuana, pot, grass, ganja, Mary Jane. Some people I know have referred to it as the devil's lettuce. It has a wide array of different titles, colloquial and otherwise. Now, some people ask, why do I refer to it as cannabis instead of marijuana? There is actually a cultural significance and understanding of the term cannabis. Cannabis is the neutral scientific term for the plant in and of itself. The term marijuana was actually sort of coined in US and Canadian culture about a century ago during anti-drug movement and anti-drug policy and legislation. The term was actually the Spanish pronunciation or knowledge of the word cannabis, and was actually used to stigmatize immigration in the southern United States, people moving up from Central America to the US. Cannabis was associated with people who moved up to the States from the countries to the South, and was seen as a dangerous substance. It was seen as being linked to crime. It was seen as being linked to violence. When in reality, those who moved from Central America were only actually reporting a slightly higher use than the southern US states were at the time. And many of those people who were moving up to the US at the time were fleeing famine and were fleeing civil war. However, anti-immigration practices pushed for an illegalization and a ban of cannabis, and at the time, the title cannabis was stripped away and it was replaced with the word marijuana. In more recent years, you'll start to notice that more legislation, including the Canadian government, has actually shifted away from using the word marijuana and moving to the word cannabis because it's a more neutral and actually a more correct term. Not just politically correct, but actually structurally and linguistically correct to refer to it as cannabis. It carries less stigma than the word marijuana as well. Yeah, fun little fact. So, what about alcohol? What do we know about alcohol? Got a few people on here tonight. What do you know about alcohol? What have you heard about alcohol? What's your experience with alcohol? A socially accepted substance. It absolutely is. Alcohol is one of the most commonly used psychoactive substances in Canada, the US, and around the world. It is a depressant. You will actually have some youth try to tell you that alcohol is a stimulant. And their logic is that if they consume alcohol when they get drunk or they get impaired, they say they feel hyper. They say they feel more impulsive. They say they feel like doing more things than they normally would. The reason that they feel this way is that their inhibitions, their judgment, their problem solving in many sections of the brain have actually become depressed by the sedating effects of alcohol. So it's not that it's stimulating these feelings of energy, it's that it's actually depressing most of our inhibitions. I see someone pointed out the fact that alcohol is considered harmless. This is an excellent point, and it's something we're going to explore tonight. Alcohol is a distilled or fermented drink known for its intoxicating effects. Did you know that alcohol is associated with over 200 long-term health risks? And that it is also one of the only substances that humans consume that damages every single organ in the human body? Now, I say this as someone that I consume alcohol occasionally. I will have a beer here or there. I'll have a gin and tonic here or there. But I understand that alcohol does carry risk to the body. But because it's considered harmless, especially in modern culture, especially in media, we often see alcohol consumption depicted as drinking more, having more. There's a coolness or a social acceptance of the more you drink, somehow the more acceptable you are. When in reality, what we know from a health lens, the more a person consumes, the more they expose themselves to risks, which we'll get into later. Now, what about vaping? Vaping is the act of heating an aerosol created by an electronic cigarette or vaporizer and inhaling the vapor. Or, to put it simply, a vape, an e-cigarette or a vape pen, uses electronic heat to warm up a liquid or a plant itself of tobacco or cannabis. And as it is heated up, it releases the vapor, which is then inhaled into the lungs. Vaping, by many communities and many groups, is perceived as being harmless or very low risk. There is some misconception here, and we're going to get into that tonight. This is why I marry the idea of vaping and cigarettes in this presentation, because while they are separate products, they do carry similarities that we want to make sure we understand clearly. When should I start speaking with my kids about drugs? Well, a common refrain we will hear from communities is that there may be those who feel that it's best to wait to speak with the youth about substance use until they're legally old enough to consume it, which here in Ontario is 19. We know we have people from across Canada tonight that they may be from Quebec, where by drinking age may be 18, but age to consume cannabis is 21. They may be from Alberta, where drinking cannabis use is 18. But if I were to say to you it's best to wait to speak with youth about substance use until they're a legal age, would you say that's true or would you say that's false? And you can put your response here in the chat panel. Let me know what you think. False. 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 Survey says the answer here is false. Now, a lot of people know this is false. So why is it false? Well, the average age that youth try tobacco and alcohol for the first time is about 13 years old, okay, according to the Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol, and Drug Survey, which collected data, by the way, from about 60,000 youth in 2021, 2022, as well as 60,000 youth in 2019, and about 50,000 youth in 2017. So all told, about 170,000 youth over the last 7 years, of whom we know the average age they first tried using alcohol and tobacco was around age 13. And furthermore, 1 in 5 teens actually report high risk drinking, which is 5 or more drinks per occasion, starting by the time they hit grade 9. Now, they report first time cannabis use around age 14. So, this is why we recommend that these conversations begin early on. If we wait until a youth is old enough to legally consume a substance, we're taking the risk that they've already been using for a number of years. Either they've seen or they've experienced or they've been exposed to risks or harms with these substances. That's why we encourage the conversation to start early. Now, some people say they may not feel comfortable. They may feel uncertain of what that looks like. We're going to help you with that tonight. We're going to give you some strategies. We're going to give you some pointers on how to initiate those conversations. And the reason that we like to do this with parents is that we know that 2/3 of teens, according to our own tracking studies, 2/3 of teens actually report that they get information that they rely on about substances from their parents in school. So even if you feel like they're not listening, statistically, we know they are. This is why we encourage you to keep this conversation going. That's why we encourage you to keep talking. Do you know what age range reports the highest rate of overall substance use? This includes tobacco, this includes alcohol, this includes cannabis, and this includes vaping. Is it teens, young adults, adults 25 to 64, or seniors over the age of 65? What do we think? See what the audience thinks here. Vote says young adults, young adults. Give you a few more moments here. 15 to 19, teens. So we're really looking at the younger demographic here, teens and young adults. If we're being specific, young adults is number one, but teens is generally right behind them. Youth ages 20 to 24 report the highest rate of overall substance use in Canada. Now, I'm using past 30-day substance use here just because it's the closest to active substance use. A lot of other surveys, they use past 12 months, so they look at people that have reported using drugs in the past year. One thing I like about the Canadian Tobacco and Nicotine survey is it's talking about really active users, people that have used in the past month. And what they found is that about 2/3 of young adults report using alcohol, about a quarter report using cannabis, and about 1 in 8 report using tobacco and vaping. The numbers overall are slightly lower than or among adults and slightly lower as well among teens. But teens also report a higher rate of vaping and cannabis use than ages 20 and above. But what's also worth noting is that the majority of teens actually don't report past 30-day substance use, and that actually includes alcohol. Now, why do I point this out? I point this out because sometimes when we frame our conversations on drug use with young people, we frame these conversations around this idea that everyone's doing it. We say, well, everyone's doing it, but, and we try to build off from there, that the decision needs to be theirs. The problem is if we start that conversation by saying everyone is using, we may actually be influencing them to consider use because we've just told them that substance use is normal, that it's normal in that the majority of people use, when in reality, no research actually shows a majority using. Parental monitoring strategies. These are actually things we're going to chat about sort of in the last quarter of the presentation when it comes to preventing teenagers from substance use. And one of these ways that we can actually help encourage this comes up in this slide. If we remind teens when we're having conversations about drugs, that we actually remind them that the amount of people that actually report using substances is in the minority and that the majority of people don't use, it serves as a reminder that people's decisions around drugs cannot be based on what they think is going on around them. Sometimes you'll have a teen say, well, everyone's using drugs, but they base it on the fact that everyone that they see is using. But they're not thinking about the people that they don't see who are not using. Case in point, a quarter of young adults report using cannabis. So let's say 10 people get together and smoke weed together, or they share a couple joints, share a couple bongs, what have you. The interpretation there may be if these 10 people are together, well, in that person's reality, everyone is using. But they're not thinking about the 30 other people around who don't use cannabis, who are not there at that given time. So sometimes if we can remind youth that substance use is actually in the minority and that the majority of people don't actually use drugs, this can help remind them that if they were to actually base their decisions on what's really going on in the world as a whole, they'd actually be less likely to use drugs. Little food for thought. But why do they use? Why do youth use substances? This is a fair question. And it's one that can actually help encourage dialogue with young people about drugs. A teen discloses to you that they're vaping. They say they've started smoking. They've started smoking weed. They've been drinking. Maybe they've tried other drugs. Why do you think they do? What do we think? A coping strategy. Absolutely. Curiosity, social group. Loving the responses here. Peer pressure. So there's a social factor there. There's curiosity. The number one answer that youth actually report using substances, according to multiple sources, is in fact curiosity. Number two answer tends to be pleasure. People say they feel good when they use drugs. There's also the social factors, right? The idea of fitting in, the idea of peer pressure. There's also the influence of media, the things that they believe are going on around them, the things they see on TV, on social media, what have you. There's the idea of coping as well as perceived medical reasons or benefits. Curiosity is an interesting one. Over half of teens that are surveyed that ask about why they use substances report curiosity as a reason they may try a substance. But what's also worth noting is that the majority of teens that say they try a drug out of curiosity don't actually report continuing to use it. In other words, the majority who try find it's not for them and they don't keep using. Second, when we look at these other factors, pleasure, social factors, media, coping, and perceived medical reasons, a conversation that helps to have with a young person if they talk about why they started using drugs is to take this conversation a little further and ask why they're continuing to use. So let's use peer pressure as an example. Peer pressure can certainly be a reason that a young person may try a drug or may start to use a drug. but it tends not to be what keeps them using a drug. So let's say teen goes to a party, friends of theirs are drinking, they get pressured into having a few beers or having a few shots with them. This may happen a couple of times. Now, as they get older, they may no longer associate with those friends. They move away, they go to college, they get a job, they settle down in a relationship, whatever would have you, but their social group changes. And now that social group is no longer consuming, or it's consuming less, or there's no pressure being applied. If peer pressure were the deciding factor in their substance use, well, then they're less likely to continue using. And second, if they're uncomfortable with using, they're probably going to change that social group on their own. So if a youth ever says or discloses that they tried using out of peer pressure, what also helps to consider is why they're still using. So if a young person says that they've begun drinking because they were drinking with their friends or they were drinking at parties, but maybe they've begun drinking alone. Well, now that reason for using is likely changed. It could be less about the pressure going on around them and more about they found something else is happening when they're drinking. And that could be something like coping. They're dealing with stress, they're dealing with hardship, they're dealing with trauma, and they're looking for something to make themselves feel better in the moment. There's a significant amount of research done and continues to be done on the impact of substance use and coping. And this is a subject that really can't be understated. And I point this out because, or rather, it can't be overstated. It really needs to be understood. If a young person is struggling with stress in their life, anxiety, depression, hardship, grief, they're going to try to find something to make themselves feel better. That's a human condition. But turning to substance use, it does help to have that conversation with them about whether that drug is actually helping get them through what's bothering them. And I'll use nicotine as an example here. Many people talk about smoking or vaping as a way to manage stress. But one thing that they don't realize is that a side effect of nicotine withdrawal is actually increased stress and anxiety. And these withdrawal symptoms can take effect as soon as 4 or 5 hours after the last time a person's consumed nicotine. In other words, a person may claim that they use a drug to cope with stress without realizing that the drug is actually causing them more stress. And if they're not resolving the thing that was causing them stress in the first place, this is just adding more stress on top of their ongoing issues. Now, if we were to ask a youth why they use drugs, is it also worth asking why they don't? This is a great question to have if you ever ask a young person and they say they don't use a drug. And the reason I do this is it helps to reaffirm their position. So I'll ask the audience, why do you think young people do not use drugs? Fear, disinterest, absolutely. Why else? Life goals, absolutely. They have ambitions, they have values, they may not want to be influenced by the presence of substances. Take a couple more here. Afraid to lose control, absolutely. It's interesting when you actually look at these lists, you'll notice that they're quite similar to one another. We see the fear of consequence, negative experiences, stigma or judgment, values or opinions, and effects on the body and mind. So you'll actually notice that many of the factors that go into substance use or substance non-use are based on similar principles. Some people may choose to use a drug. Let's use cannabis as an example because they've heard that cannabis may have certain medical benefits. Others may choose not to use cannabis, especially when they learn of the risks of cannabis use, which we'll speak about tonight. So there's a health factor that plays in here. There's a social factor that someone may say they use because they don't want to be judged for not using, or they are associating with other people who use a substance, and there's a shared interest there. Others may say they don't want to use drugs because they don't want to be judged for not using. We also have that idea of the value structure. Some people use because they're curious, some people use because they feel good. Others do not use because they find they feel worse when they use, or they don't want to deal with the negative experiences or consequences. So when you actually consider these lists and discuss them with a young person, it does help to really understand where they're coming from and meet them where they're at, which we hear a lot in the social services. But it also serves as an opportunity to engage with them and let them be a bit of a professional in the conversation. They get to speak about what's on their mind. They get to speak about their own situation. And what we can cultivate from here is empathy. We can build relationships, we can build conversation by listening without judgment to their reasons for use as well as their reasons for non-use. Helps kind of create more of a balanced perspective. Teens and young adults that use cannabis reported blank during the COVID pandemic. Was it using the same amount, using less, or using more? What do we think? And I want you to think about that list you just saw, right? Some people say same, more, less, more, less. What we actually saw was those who reported using cannabis actually reported an increase in cannabis use. And if you look at the reasons why they said they did, we'll get to those in a moment. Sorry, I forgot to put this one in. We saw that legalization didn't factor into cannabis use changes. So what we saw, I put this up to kind of debunk that myth that legalization caused young people to use more cannabis. It didn't. We did see an increase. Oh, absolutely. You're more than welcome to, Ariel. Um, what I was going to say before I get into the COVID discussion is a little bit about the legalization discussion. I used to talk about this in a previous position I held. There was a fear after legalization that cannabis use was going to skyrocket among teens. There's actually no research that says that it did. In fact, the research has overwhelmingly shown that cannabis use among teens, it went up slightly, but not a lot, because legalization didn't factor into their decision because it was still illegal for teens to use. But COVID, we saw an increase, especially as the pandemic continued. And the reasons that young people cited for increasing their cannabis use go back to those reasons that we spoke about of why a youth would use substances. They talked about the idea they lost a regular schedule. They were bored. They were curious. They talked about stress. They talked about anxiety. Some cited relaxation. But the more specific factors that were considered risks for increased consumption, these included people that reported loneliness, concern about their financial well-being, worsening mental health, pre-existing drinking or cannabis use, lower education, or working in a job that increased the risk of contracting COVID. Or to make this much simpler, youth who were feeling stressed and youth who were feeling disconnected from their communities were more likely to report increasing their use of drugs. This was the same thing that happened with alcohol as well. And what we can say from this and what we can glean from this is the importance of engaging with a young person in terms of their interests, of their coping mechanisms, of their joys and of their interests, and taking interest in that as well. If a young person has an interest in sports, it's getting them registered and involved in intramurals, after school programs, rec leagues, competitive leagues, and as parents, doing what we can to support them in that. If it means we can drive them out to those events, great. If not, trying to organize things like ride shares or carpooling. If it's interest in things like instruments, it could be doing music lessons. If it's interest in things like video games or sports, it could be engaging with them about what sort of teams they like. What are they watching? What are they playing? Now, they may not want to always talk with you about these kinds of things. That's okay. But check in with them. Just let them know that you have an interest in their values. You have an interest in the things they enjoy because you want them to remember those are important to them. Because what we saw during COVID was they lost a lot of that. When they lost those communities, when they lost those interests, and when their stress increased, they started using drugs more. Which of the following methods of cannabis use is the most common in Canada? Is it smoking dried leaf product? Is it dabbing extracts? Is it vaping e-liquids? Or is it consuming edibles? What do we think? Smoking. Survey says smoking is actually number one. In fact, in 2021 here in Ontario, it was reported that for every $10 that was spent on cannabis products, $7 of it was spent on dried leaf product and pre-rolled joints. So smoking still does remain number one. Vaping is number two among youth. Edibles is number three. If we combine all ages together, edibles is the second most common, and then vaping. Now, the average youth spends about $65 a month on recreational cannabis, as well as about $60 a month on vape products and about $95 a month on alcohol. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And that's household, rather, spends $95 a month on alcohol. Youth, that number can vary quite widely. I've seen it $20 a month. I've seen it $80 a month. I've seen it $50 a month. I've seen it $200 a month. Alcohol is a very wide discrepancy in the expenditures. Now, the most common sources of cannabis products for teens include legal storefronts and friends. It helps to understand if you're speaking with someone and they talk about using cannabis to ask how they use. Different methods of cannabis actually present different risks. For instance, if a person uses vape products, Vape products are far more potent and much stronger than joints, pipes, and bongs. So these products can cause a great deal more intoxication with less of the product being used. Edibles present a different risk because they affect the body more slowly. A vape or a smoked product can affect the body within seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 2 minutes. An edible can take anywhere from 30 minutes to 4 hours, depending on the individual. So, if a young person who's unfamiliar with edibles consumes one and they don't feel anything, they may be more inclined to try more and try more and try more and try more, to the point where we've actually seen, we saw this at Sick Kids in 2020, I think it was 2021 or 2022, that edible cannabis consumption actually resulted in more ICU visits for young people than any other method of cannabis consumption. And a lot of that was due to the fact that young people didn't understand they needed to wait before consuming more to see how they felt. So when you're speaking with a young person about cannabis, it does help if they disclose that they're using to ask how they're using. And if you're trying to reduce risk, if they're still choosing to use, aware of the risk, aware of the harms, one thing to recommend is if they're using edibles to start with a very small amount and wait about 30 minutes to an hour just to see how they feel, to let it digest. And if they're smoking or vaping, to recommend that they look for lower potency products, which are generally natural plant products. Or if they are vaping, to limit their consumption to one pull to see how they feel. Which of the following skills can be affected by the presence of THC in the brain? Is it judgment, decision making, memory, mood regulation, or all of the above? All of the above. Survey says, I see everyone saying all. You would indeed be correct. Now, when people use cannabis, when people talk about impairment, particularly by THC or tetrahydrocannabinol, THC causes those feelings of euphoria, pleasure, excitement, relaxation, can cause a wide array of different feelings depending on the person that uses it. However, one thing we know about THC universally is that it does affect many of the skills that the brain sort of needs to function properly, including judgment, memory, and mood regulation. Now, the short term risks of using THC on the brain, particularly for young people, include the loss of coordination, confusion, anxiety, fear or panic attacks, impaired memory, reduced reaction time, or depth perception. Now, the long term risks can include memory loss, dependency, negative impacts or effects to decision making and problem solving, as well as mental health risks. We do know that THC and cannabis use have a correlation with depression, as well as anxiety disorders and suicidal ideation, as well as psychological risks. Now, this is particularly for people that have a history of psychosis or schizophrenia or a genetic vulnerability. Those who do and consume cannabis are more likely to experience the onset or early onset of these conditions than those who do not use. So again, these risks are elevated for people that use cannabis before the age of 25. And one of the things that we're actually going to be doing this summer at DFK is I'm actually going to be building and expanding on the cannabis content, which we know there's a great wide array of it available, to actually build a larger presentation exploring many of the things that I spoke about here in greater depth on cannabis. So stay tuned on that. What do we know about the health risks specific to cannabis? Well, the first thing to consider is dependency. There is a myth that cannabis is not addictive. This is untrue. We know that approximately 1 in 11, or about 9% of people that use cannabis in their lifetime, will develop an addiction to using it. They find they have to use more than they did in the past to feel the same effects. They feel unwell when they cannot use. They may break laws to try to get their hands on cannabis products, or break laws while impaired, or they may find it begins to affect their social, personal, or professional lives in an adverse way as they continue to use. This risk doubles among people who use cannabis during their teenage years. As the brain develops, it is more susceptible to developing dependencies or addictions to substances like cannabis. So those who begin using before the age of 25. This is why it's recommended that people who are considering using cannabis wait until they're older. There's a lot to be said about that when it comes to cannabis and the brain's development. And again, I'd love to get into this deeper, but I know that we're here till about 7:30, and I want to make sure I can touch on all three substances. So if you'd like to learn more, I certainly welcome you to reach out to access our website, or you can send me an email at any time. I'll put my email up at the end. I'm always happy to chat about this stuff further. Let's talk about vaping. Before I ask this question, What was vaping intended to do? When vape products were first launched and put onto the market, what were vape products intended to do? Is anyone in the audience familiar with them? What were vapes meant to be used for? As a cessation aid, correct. They were meant to help people quit smoking. They were meant to help people get off of using tobacco. Tobacco products we know contain over 80 carcinogens. In fact, we know that up to half of smokers, and I've even seen the number as high as 52%, according to some research, of people that use tobacco will die from the cancers that we know tobacco causes. It is associated with over 40 different diseases, including 16 different types of cancer. So, with that in mind, vape products were developed as a low-risk method of smoking cessation. In fact, over half of people over the age of 25, according to the Canadian Tobacco and Nicotine Survey, still use vape products to help quit. Do you know what percentage of teens who report vaping in the last month have never actually tried tobacco in their life? Is it 8, 19, 46, or 61%? Survey says 61%. It is half. The majority of people that vape under the age of 19 do so without actually having smoked before. Like I said, in 2021, 58% of adults over age 25 said they vaped as a way to quit smoking. But vape pens and e-cigarettes have evolved into their own product, which are continuously used by youth and adults alike in Canada. Many vape products contain nicotine, which we know is a significantly addictive substance. In fact, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 80 to 90% of people that use nicotine will become addicted to using it. And like I said earlier, 15% of teens and about 17% of young adults report past 30-day vaping. But 61% of teens and 24% of young adults who vape never actually tried tobacco in their life. Some research even suggests that youth vaping may even preclude or lead to tobacco use. In fact, the Canadian Tobacco and Nicotine Survey actually reported that 2/3 of teens and 1/3 of young adults who currently smoke tobacco actually report having vaped first. The other thing to consider about vaping, and we're going to talk about this more in the next few minutes, is that the long-term effects of the chemicals in vape products remain largely unknown. We've known for a very long time the health risks of tobacco. But what's actually worth considering is that tobacco wasn't actually linked to health, to lung health risks and cancers in Parliament until the 1960s. But yet tobacco was traded commercially in the development of cigars, cigarettes, tobacco pipes, etc., for 300 years here in North America. But it wasn't until the 1960s that the federal government actually acknowledged that there was a link between tobacco use and lung cancer. Research can take time. I point this out with vaping, not to say that vaping will be shown as a more significant issue. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we don't know those long-term effects. And until we do, it's hard to say one way or the other how risky or not risky it is. We also know that teens are about 3 times more likely to report vaping to reduce stress versus adults, and that young adults are about twice as likely. Furthermore, we know that people who smoke are actually more likely to be diagnosed with mood, anxiety, and panic disorders, as well as depression. This is significantly more common among young adults, as well as adults under 50 and teens. One thing I learned of interest actually over the last several months is that nicotine dependence even runs comorbid with schizophrenia. In fact, many countries that look into this topic have actually found that the prevalence of heavy smoking among people that live with schizophrenia and psychosis is as high as 90%. Now, one thing that we've learned of interest about this is that nicotine is a stimulant. Nicotine is a very powerful stimulant. That's why it affects the brain the way that it does. It increases focus, it increases alertness, it increases feelings of energy, feelings of pleasure. That's what makes nicotine such a pleasurable substance. But it wears off very quickly and can cause feelings of irritability, headaches, migraines, dizziness, a lack of focus, lack of energy. Thus, people feel like they need to consume more. This creates a very, very quick forming dependent or sort of chain of dependence, if you will. People that live with psychosis, people that live with schizophrenia, and people that take maybe antipsychotic medications may be more likely to experience issues with severe depression, apathy, lack of motivation, lack of energy, or issues regulating their mood. And one thing that we've actually seen suggested is they may turn to using nicotine to try to alleviate those feelings. Now, this is not me saying that nicotine is solving an issue here. It's a coping mechanism that people are using in this situation. However, they are increasing the risk or exposing themselves to the risk of lung conditions if they choose to use tobacco to get nicotine. How much does the average teen spend on vape products in Canada per week? Is it $5, $15, $25, or $40? What do we think? 5. I actually alluded to this a few slides ago. $25. What do you think? $15, 5. According to the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation, the answer is only about $15 a week. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up. Cannabis, like we said earlier, is about $65 a month. This would put our annual total for vaping and cannabis at around $780 a year. Now, again, household averages when it comes to alcohol are about $1,100 a year. So if we were to put this at around, say, the $60 mark that we see with vaping and cannabis, this would mean that youth would spend an average of about $180 to $200 a month on substance use. So if we add the 780, and the $600 a month that we talk about with alcohol, if we say they spend $50 a month, this would put us to approximately $2,000, $2,200. So sometimes a conversation you can have with a young person when it comes to trying to deter or sway their decisions around substance use may not be about the mental health risk, but even considering financial literacy and budgeting, which I've actually found over the years is actually quite fascinating to young people. If a youth is spending $780 a year on vaping, $780 on cannabis, and let's say $700 on alcohol, that's about $2,200 a year, $2,260. If you multiply that out by 4 years, if they started this substance use expenditures in grade 9, by the time they finish in grade 12, that would have meant they spent about $8,800 to $9,000 on substance use. That adds up. So sometimes you can ask a young person, what else could you be doing with that money? And is this something that you need to be spending money on, or is this something that you simply want to be spending money on? And having them look at it less from a mental health perspective and more of a pragmatic financial literacy perspective may be another inroad to have these discussions. Plus, it helps as a great way to get them thinking about budgeting, because we all know people need to learn a little bit more about budgeting. Which of these cannabis products contains the highest concentration of THC? Is it dried leaf product, edibles, or e-liquids? E-liquids being vape products. E-liquids? The answer here is e-liquids. So vaping cannabis, like I said, is the third most common method of cannabis consumption overall, and the second most common among teens, according to the Canadian Cannabis Survey. But we also know that vape products can contain up to or over 90% THC. That is 3 times the potency of the max level of what we're currently seeing of a dried leaf product, of a joint, a pipe, a bong. Now, increasing the amount of THC that a person consumes increases the risk of both physical and psychological harms, which would be characterized by something like cannabis poisoning, which is possible. Physical symptoms and psychological symptoms of cannabis poisoning can include nausea, vomiting, fever, heart palpitations, delusions, hallucinations, or in select cases, these can include things like cannabis-induced psychotic episodes, which can last for up to a period of 30 to 35 days, or long-term physical risks such as cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which is caused by the continuous use of heavy cannabis products high in THC, which can cause many of those physical conditions which I spoke about, as well as significant and onset and ongoing dehydration, which can in serious cases cause renal kidney failure. So it is recommended that people who use THC limit their consumption, particularly those who live with psychosis, schizophrenia, or history of these conditions. And if anyone begins feeling these physical symptoms of elevated THC use, it's recommended that they take a break from consumption, or if they find they're in a position that they're experiencing significant delusions, hallucinations, or any sort of extreme negative feelings, profuse vomiting, nausea, that they can contact a healthcare provider. Do you know what percentage of Canadians over the age of 15 report actually mixing substances together? And this is cannabis, alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, um, alcohol, vaping, other drugs with alcohol, other drugs with weed. What do we think? 21%, The answer is actually a little lower. It's about 12%. It's about 1 in 8 Canadians over the age of 15 report mixing substances together. This is actually most commonly reported by young people, by males, and by those who report vaping. But what's interesting is even though those who report vaping report being more likely to mix substances together, the two substances that are the most likely to be mixed together are alcohol and cannabis, at about 29% of people that say they mix drugs together. Programs and policies that aim at prevention and discussions about substance use, according to the Government of Canada, are actually recommended to address the use of multiple substances rather than just one at a time, especially because we know that mixing substances together carries significant risk. Furthermore, being able to discuss multiple substances instead of just focusing on one creates a more holistic conversation with a young person. And if we do consider those risks of mixing substances, they can include unpredictable effects. Let's start with alcohol and cannabis as an example. Like I said, about 30% of people that mix drugs mix those together. Research has actually shown that people that drink alcohol before consuming cannabis, that alcohol can increase the body's ability to metabolize and use THC, which means that a person can actually get more high from using less cannabis, which increases the risk of cannabis poisoning. Furthermore, mixing the conditions of cannabis impairment with alcohol impairment, including things like dizziness, nausea, hallucinations, vomiting, fever, passing out, which we know can be symptomatic of one or both of those. These risks of these negative effects actually increases as these drugs are mixed together. Now, if a person uses cannabis before drinking, research has also shown that cannabis can delay the body's ability to feel drunk or to feel the effect of another drug. So if a person uses cannabis and then uses another substance, they may not feel the effects that they would expect to feel from that second drug, which means that they're more likely to consume more. This increases the risk of overconsumption, overdose, and hospitalization. So it's recommended if you are working with someone or you have a kid that's discussing substance use or a young person talking about drug use, it's important to have these conversations about mixing drugs and remind them if they choose to use drugs, it's strongly recommended they stick with just using one as opposed to mixing two or more drugs together. This is also significantly a risk with things like opioids and stimulants and other sedatives, especially with alcohol. Mixing alcohol with any of those three substances or any of those three types of substances significantly increases the risk of hospitalization, overdose, and fatality. So again, if someone's drinking, it's recommended they do not use drugs as well. And if they're using drugs, it is recommended they do not drink alcohol. Unlike tobacco cigarettes, vape products are a risk-free method of consuming nicotine. You accept or challenge this statement. Now you'll notice I didn't call this true or false. Accept is the idea, this makes sense, it sounds true. Challenge is you may have some questions about it. What do we think? Challenge, challenge, challenge. This is definitely a statement that you do want to challenge. There is validity and truth to this statement, but there's also a bit of misconception. I'll explain this. Smoking tobacco contains over 80 carcinogens, which we know are cancer-causing agents. These include things like heavy metals, benzene, tar, ammonia, cyanide. I could go on all night with the list. Vape products contain significantly lower amounts of some of these chemicals, and others aren't present in vapes at all. However, vape products themselves actually have some risks that tobacco doesn't have. I'll give you an example. Low-grade vape pens or disposable pens, those single-use pens, are actually more prone to breaking down or melting. The heating coils themselves are more likely to break down and then be ingested or inhaled. So that means inhaling like pieces and fragments of the metal. And even the plastic pens themselves, especially those lower grade ones, are more likely to melt or break down, which means the person is then inhaling plastic fumes. So it's generally recommended that people that vape spend more money in buying a higher quality vape pen with a titanium coil. And furthermore, more research is really needed on the effects of vaping on human health, because many of the additives in vapes, which I'm going to show you on the next slide, haven't really been tested in the long term for their impacts on lung health. And some of them were mostly used in flavoring or additives versus while they may be processed or digested or not digested because the lungs don't digest, as you'll see in the next slide. Now, what's inside a cigarette? Well, we have tar, With carbon monoxide burning off. So tar we know is found in the development of roads. We also know that it can build up in the lungs and be attributed to various lung diseases. Carbon monoxide is found in smoke of most things that burn off, which we know can contribute to lung diseases and lung cancers. Formaldehyde, generally used in embalming fluids. We have cyanide, which we know is poisonous, benzene, heavy metals, as well as nicotine, which, like I said, is quite addictive. Cigarettes contain a fair amount and a significant amount of rather harmful and dangerous chemicals. E-liquids, meanwhile, contain chemicals like glycerol and propylene glycol. These are often seen as additives in most food products, but their long-term impacts on the lungs is not well known. They can cause things like nausea, dizziness, dry throat, complicate existing lung conditions, COPD, emphysema, bronchitis, asthma. They can also cause dry cough. They can also cause, I think I said dizziness already. Formaldehyde is found in e-liquids as well as in cigarettes. Benzene is found in some e-liquids as well as cigarettes. Metal contaminants can be found in e-liquids. Nicotine is found in e-liquids, as well as vitamin E acetate. Now, we see this more in illegal products. Vitamin E acetate is a totally natural substance found in food. Vitamin E, if it's eaten, can help stimulate digestion. It can help with immune function. It's found in various creams and lotions. It's a very sticky substance. So it actually helps a lot of personal care products apply to the skin cleaner. Helps them apply a little bit better. The problem is vitamin E being added to illicit vapes is actually done as a way to try to thicken the juice up and make it last longer, which people then interpret as that's a better quality product. Legally, this cannot be added to a vape because what happens when a person heats up vitamin E and inhales it into the lungs, as it cools down, it returns to that sticky substance I spoke about a moment ago, and the lungs aren't actually able to pass or clear it out. This increases the risk of things like non-lipoid pneumonia, which can result in hospitalization and actually resulted in a few thousand deaths in the United States over the last few years. So, vitamin E acetate is not allowed in legal products, but it can still be found in illicit products. So, when you're having a conversation about vaping with young people, one thing to help consider is legal versus illegal products and higher quality pens versus disposable units, as well as the fact that many of the substances found in e-liquids, number one, have not been tested for their long-term effects on the body. And the things that we do know about them is that they do contribute to various lung diseases and health conditions. But we won't know more until several years go by. We've seen in media very, very well covered the idea of the opioid ongoing crisis, that 21 people a day die as a result of opioid overdoses. This is a very significant number. But a number that gets forgotten is the fact that 125 people, or 5 times that, die every single day due to smoking-related illnesses here in Canada. That is the equivalent of about 48,000 people a year in Canada and 8 million people around the world, as well as 1.3 million who die as a result of secondhand smoke. Tobacco is one of the leading preventable causes of death on the planet. When we look at vaping, again, about a fifth of youth who report vaping say they do so to reduce stress. But as we know about nicotine, nicotine can actually elevate feelings of stress over time. And 20% of people who vape actually say they do so because they become addicted to the nicotine. Finally, we know that tobacco can cause more than 40 debilitating or fatal diseases in the lungs, heart, and other vital organs. You know which of these substances is responsible for the largest overall cost to the healthcare and justice systems, combined with lost productivity and other costs here in Canada? Is it opioids, tobacco, alcohol, or cocaine? If you vote for tobacco, if you vote for alcohol, the answer here is indeed alcohol. And it's actually not even close. In 2020, the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addictions reported that substance use contributed to a total of $49 billion in total costs related to harms across Canada. Of that $49 billion, alcohol alone contributed to $19.7 billion in cost. So this would be like saying that for every $5 that we spend nationally on the harms caused by drug use, $2 of that is related specifically to alcohol. Now, when combined with tobacco, they contribute to nearly 2/3 of all total costs of substance use. These costs include approximately 270,000 hospitalizations, of which a combined 233,000 were combined to alcohol and tobacco use. Again, there's a great deal of attention paid for very good reason on the ongoing overdose crisis, for which we actually have a second presentation developed, which we'd be happy to offer for presentations. If you'd ever like to see that, feel free to let us know. But these numbers at times get forgotten. The risks of alcohol and tobacco in some cases are forgotten despite the fact that we know they are significant. These are very normalized substances. However, the discussion about their harms has not been normalized. If I were to say to you that dementia, depression, and suicidal ideation risks are higher among people who consume alcohol, would you say that that's true or that that's false? True? Unfortunately, the answer here is indeed true. Canadians with moderate to severe depression are about 3 times more likely to report problem drinking, according to the CCSA. Rate of suicide among people with alcohol dependence is actually 6 times that of the general population. In fact, this past year in Canada, there were approximately 4,000 deaths by suicide, of which 25%, or around 1,000, had alcohol involved, either as a cause or a factor in the reported suicide. Alcohol use disorders are also the largest preventable risk factor for the onset of dementia, as we know that the consumption of alcohol can impair development of the brain during adolescence, but furthermore does damage significant portions of the brain when a person continues consuming, particularly portions like the hippocampus, which are responsible for memory and coding. Alcohol consumption is also very frequently associated with violent behavior, aggressive behavior, as well as partner violence and sexual violence, according to the CCSA. Now, whenever we have a conversation about alcohol, and this is a great one for parents to consider, is that idea about sober driving, the idea of designating a driver. A youth is going out. Your kid's going out to a party. It's a Saturday night. They're going to a field party. They're going to a house party. You suspect alcohol may be involved. You know they're coming home at some point in the night. So this conversation that we often have, we ask them, how are you getting home later, right? How are you getting home later? In 2022, Canadians reported being the most likely to drive after drinking alcohol at a party, at a bar, at home, or at a friend or relative's house. You're having a conversation, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, they're going out to the bar, they're going out to a friend's house. Suspect they may be drinking at some point. We want to make sure they're getting home safe. Where do you think is the most likely place that they actually report drinking before driving? The answer, at approximately 38%, is at home. It is the number one place where Canadians actually report drinking now before driving. In 2019, before COVID, it was number 4. Motor vehicle accidents are the leading cause of death among teens and young adults in Canada, and alcohol and/or drug impairment is a factor in over half of those collisions. When we have conversations about sober driving, if the research is telling us that the most common place people are drinking before they get behind the wheel is at home, then that conversation is not just about the end of the night, it's about the beginning of the night. Have they been drinking before they go out? Has their driver been drinking before they go out? We point out the importance of sober driving, and we encourage youth to seek sober options. So, when we do this, instead of just telling them don't drink and drive, we want to promote strategies they can actually use. So a conversation you can have with a young person about sober driving is asking them, who is their DD? How are they getting where they're going safely? And they're going to tell you all sorts of things. You want them to. They're going to point out Uber. They're going to say they're calling a friend. They're going to use public transit. If it's safe, they're going to walk or ride a bike or travel, with people that they trust. But it's important that that conversation not just happen at the end of the night. It needs to happen before they leave. We know that alcohol-impaired driving represents 85% of all reported impaired driving stats, and that younger male drivers are more likely to report driving when they feel they're over the legal limit. What's also worth noting, and the reason that we continue this conversation, is that last year, the TURF Foundation, which is a traffic injury research foundation with research partnerships with CAA and funded through Desjardins Insurance, actually found that about 1 in 9 people who responded that they drove over the legal limit in the past 12 months. This is the highest level of self-reported impaired driving in Canada in more than 20 years. Self-reported impaired driving was going down from 2000 to 2020. We've actually seen it begin to climb in the last few years. So this conversation is still relevant. This conversation needs to happen, I would argue, now more than ever. As we're seeing impaired driving numbers are going up, they're not coming down anymore. Last year, the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addictions posted a new low-risk drinking guideline for which they recommended that Canadians limit alcohol consumption to a maximum of 1 to 2 drinks per day or per week. It's the last question I have for you. What do we think? Day, week, day. In 2011, the CCSA's recommendations were to limit alcohol consumption to 1 to 2 drinks per day. However, last year, the revised low-risk drinking guidelines upped that consumption, or rather lowered that consumption, to 1 to 2 drinks per week. Now, why did they do this? Many people that I've spoken with, and I've heard this across Canada, they almost saw this as an affront. They found that it was almost insulting that the idea was changed from a day to a week. But there was actually a reason. While some people may accuse these limits of being extreme, they're actually based on the evidence that emerged in the years following the 2011 recommendations. Various countries around the world, including the United Kingdom, Denmark, France, and Australia, actually accused Canada's drinking guidelines of permitting greater risk of health concerns. In the years since these limits were actually set, recent research has directly linked alcohol consumption to various health conditions on top of what we already knew, which include things like heart disease, diabetes, gout, hypertension or high blood pressure, cirrhosis of the liver, various cancers, to an additional 7 different types of cancer, including cancer of the prostate, breast cancer. The others are escaping me at the moment. But what we also found of interest is that a Canadian study showed that actually over half of alcohol attributable cancer deaths in British Columbia in 2017 were among former alcohol users and people that were actually using alcohol within the low-risk drinking guidelines from 2011, so drinking 1 or 2 a day. We also found that people in BC who use alcohol within low-risk drinking guidelines limits actually accounted for 2/3 of all hospital stays due to injuries and deaths due to digestive conditions and injuries caused by alcohol consumption. In other words, the pre-existing limit of 1 to 2 drinks per day as a low risk was not actually that low of a risk. So the resource that you see on the screen here on the right-hand side, I actually took from the CCSA, directly from their site. It's right from their low-risk drinking guidelines. They point out alcohol consumption per week. No drinks promotes better health and better sleep. 1 to 2 drinks per week, you are more likely to avoid alcohol-related consequences. However, as you continue consuming more, we see an increased risk of cancers, diabetes, hypertension, gout, various degenerative disorders to the muscles and the organs in the body, especially as alcohol consumption increases. In fact, the World Health Organization just this past year reported that there is no level of alcohol consumption that is deemed safe. Finally, alcohol use and health risks. 1 in 5 Canadians over the age of 15 meet the criteria for alcohol abuse over their lifetime. And 6 million Canadians over the age of 12 report heavy drinking at least once a month. As I mentioned earlier, alcohol is one of the only substances that damages every organ in the body, and its use is linked to over 200 diseases and long-term health risks. Now, we want to take this information. We've got to the bottom of the hour. We've got about 20 minutes left. We want to take this information and sort of figure out, how do we have discussion about this? How do we take all of this knowledge, encapsulate it into a conversation with a young person? We need to remember a few things. Number one, we need to remember that substance use exists on a spectrum. If someone discloses to you, if your child discloses to you, if a student discloses to you, if a peer or a client discloses to you that they use substances, this does not mean automatically that they are suffering a problem of use, because substance use exists on a spectrum. Most people don't use drugs. We talked about this earlier. Some people use substances for beneficial purposes. If you think about cannabis, cannabis actually has medical applications. It can be used to stimulate appetite for people going through chemotherapy or radiation treatment or experiencing significant eating disorders. It can also be used to prevent feelings of nausea and vomiting in low doses for people living with HIV, AIDS, or cancer, again, going through advanced radiation treatments. Beneficial use is the prescribed legal use of a substance that can have positive health, social, or spiritual effects. Now, most people who do use substances recreationally would report low risk use. they'll have minimal negative impact on a person's life. This may be someone who consumes and once or twice a year reports having a hangover, but they designated a driver, they made sure they got where they were going safely, they drank with people that they knew. If they were consuming cannabis, they set limits to their consumption, but maybe they got impaired and said something a little embarrassing because their judgment was impaired. These are low risk. Where we see higher risk use is where the substance begins to have a harmful and negative impact on the person's life. They begin skipping obligations, missing shifts at work, missing assignments at school, cutting out of class, isolating or spending more time alone, or only finding they can enjoy themselves when they're impaired by a substance. And if we see this increase further, we may see the point of addiction, whereby an individual experiences a treatable medical condition whereby their use has become compulsive and recurring to the point that they cannot feel well if they are not using. But what's important to note is that a person can move back and forth between these stages over time. And if a young person discloses they're using drugs, it doesn't automatically mean that they're over here on the right. Again, in most cases, they are at low risk use. Our hope is that we can move them closer to the left, closer to low risk use or closer to non-use. We point out the health risks, we point out the complications, but we also identify where they're at and their reasons for using to have them consider if they're actually getting a substance for the reasons that they want, and if they're getting out of it what they're intending. Because if they're not, which in many cases they will find is the case, it's worth having them consider, what are some alternative strategies I can use to feel a certain way? What are some other things I can do that I enjoy? What are some other things that I can do to cope with a stressful situation? We bring up healthy coping strategies here. I'm not going to get into great detail about the risks of substance use because we talked about these for the last hour. We know there's risk of tolerance, risk of dependence, withdrawal, and overdose, and you can learn a lot more about this on our website. There's risks of cancer, particularly from things like cannabis and alcohol. There's additional health, or rather tobacco and alcohol. There's additional health risks. In the case of cannabis, recent research has actually linked THC use to heart attack and stroke in young adults and middle-aged Canadians. So it is also worth noting that there is a connection there between THC use and heart disease. We know there's behavioral risks, including isolation, spending more than you can afford, breaking laws or impulsive decisions, as well as impaired driving, as well as the psychological factors which we've spoken about before: stress, depression, anxiety, psychosis, schizophrenia, hallucinations, delusions, mood changes, and impaired focus. Again, to learn more about many of these, you can visit many of the resources offered on our website, drugfreekidscanada.org. But the strategies we want to consider when it comes to reducing risk of substance use: when it comes to cannabis and alcohol, we recommend the delay of use until the age of 25 to allow the brain to fully develop. We also recommend using cannabis products with lower THC content. And if you ever have any youth that are talking about using things like Spice or K2, these are also known as synthetic cannabis. These products were created before cannabis was legal as a way to sort of skirt the definition of what cannabis is. They have effects similar to cannabis. However, they can actually cause organ failure and seizure. They can be fatal to use. So it's recommended if someone is using cannabis, they avoid the synthetic products in favor of more natural products. If they're drinking alcohol, it's recommended that they set limits to their consumption, not drinking more than 3 to 4 drinks on occasion. Plan ahead if they're driving, designate a sober driver on all aspects of travel, not just coming home, but when they go out as well. Avoid substance use if you are pregnant or have a history of psychological disorders, and speak with your doctor if you're using any of these substances, especially if you're using other medications, as alcohol and cannabis can have some very dangerous or risky interactions with medications and prescriptions. Avoid mixing substances together, again, especially with alcohol, and use in a safe space with people that you trust. And seek medical attention as needed. Now, we have parents listening tonight. I mentioned at the beginning that 2/3 of youth say they get the information that they trust from their parents, followed by school at 56%, friends at 26%. We also know that about 95% of parents who reported having a conversation with their child about substances have also reported that it has a positive influence on their child's behavior, according to our tracking studies. So we know that you make a difference, and you stand to prevent those risks of early substance use. You act as a protective factor. Well, how do you do that? It's one thing to learn the information that we spoke about tonight, to be able to identify risk and harms. If that's all you do in a conversation with a young person, you risk sounding biased, or you risk sounding too far on one side of the conversation. And if they see people using drugs and not experiencing those harms, well, if you haven't spoken about anything else, that conversation may become a little less credible. So we recommend Staying educated, not just understanding the facts about the risks and harms. We want to identify those, but we also want to identify the reasons a person is using a substance to show that we can be empathetic to their situation. If they're citing use due to stress, if they're citing use due to coping, if they're citing use due to any possible medical benefits that they may be experiencing or think that they're experiencing, it helps to ask questions about that. What's going on in their life that's causing them stress? What's causing them grief? And reminding them that you are there to support them in that regard as well. And if they're using for any medical reasons, if they are experiencing a medical issue, it helps to get them in touch with their family doctor, their healthcare practitioner, or another healthcare advisor. You also want to set goals in your conversation. And when you set goals, it's important to be flexible. These can be different depending on the age of youth. You're going to have a different goal talking about substance use with a 10-year-old than you are talking about substance use with a 20-year-old. You want to create goals that are collaborative in nature. And what that means is that you can work on them with the youth. Case in point, you're talking about cannabis. Maybe I've pointed out some things tonight that you didn't know about cannabis. If you're having a conversation with a young person, say you're talking to your kid, hey, I learned this in a presentation tonight. Was listening to this guy, Steve, ramble on for a long time. He talks a lot. Sometimes he doesn't know when to stop. But you know what? I had a great time. I learned this. What do you think about it? And if they don't know, or if they ask a follow-up question that you're unfamiliar with, a goal you can set is that you'll look up that information together. You'll be able to share some resources. It allows you to act as a professional, but it also invites them to do the same. You're engaging with them. You're not lecturing at that point. You're inviting them into a conversation because the conversation is to be had with them, not to them. Of course, I say this, I realize as I'm presenting a lecture tonight, but even as I do that, you'll notice I've been trying to ask you as many questions as I can. I'm inviting your responses. That's the same way you want to approach youth. Even in the strategies that I'm talking about, I'm trying to employ them in how we present. I ask questions because I want to hear your interpretations. I want to hear your responses. Find a comfortable setting. You know where that is. Your child knows where that is. That could be at home. That could be the living room. Could be the kitchen. Could be in the car. Some people feel a little trapped when they're in the car having conversations. Some people love it. Could be a cafe. Could be through text. But you want to identify where that is. And you also want to identify where on that continuum of use a youth is. Not just are they using or are they not using, but what is their knowledge about cannabis? What do they know about drugs? Because it invites them to share the knowledge they have, but it also invites you to try to fill in some of those blanks and to help them find that knowledge. Again, it makes your goals collaborative. You also want to consider the importance of active listening. When to have these conversations is important. If your child goes to a party, drinks heavily, they come home and they're wasted, they're extremely intoxicated, or they come home the next morning hungover, they're pale, they're weak, they're exhausted, they're vomiting, they're dehydrated. This may not be the best time to have a conversation about alcohol use. They're exhausted, they're moody, they're hurting, they're suffering. The last thing that they need at that moment is a lecture about the pain they're going through. They know it, they're feeling it. But you may want to consider having that conversation a couple days later, letting them get some rest, showing that you support them, getting them something to drink. They're dehydrated, making sure they're still eating, taking care of them when they're unwell, to remind them that you are there as a care provider. Encourage dialogue. Again, encourage it by asking questions. And these questions can be open-ended. You'll notice as I was presenting tonight, I had trivia questions, sure, to try to keep engagement. But I even tried to ask why you believed something, what you thought about something, how does something happen? Because what you're doing there is you're encouraging them to speak more. And the more we listen, the more we learn, right? You want to summarize what you've heard. Someone brings up a point, you want to summarize it back. They communicate that they're stressed. They communicate that they've had a hard day. You listen to why that happened and you summarize the main ideas and ask if you're right. Ask if that's correct. Ask them to expand. That helps show sincerity. You want to remain positive. This doesn't mean that you praise or offer praise for the fact that they use substance. That's not what I mean by remaining positive. Remaining positive is about using positive messaging. I used impaired driving as an example of this earlier. Instead of telling youth don't drink and drive, if you provide no other option, they're actually more likely to drink and drive because you gave them no other alternative. But if your message is positively framed, the things they can do, they can designate a driver. They can call an Uber as long as they understand how Uber works and they need a credit card. They can access transportation. They can call you. And if you're not sober, you have a way to get them home. Remain positive and you show empathy. The last couple of weeks, I've been doing several presentations at colleges. I've presented at about 5 or 6 of them here in Ontario, including TMU, Trent, Fleming Loyalist, and Seneca. And I asked this question, a little tongue in cheek. Do you have a conversation about drugs with toddlers? Well, probably not. We're not going to talk about opioid analogs or the impact of tetrahydrocannabinol on an adolescent brain with a 2-year-old. But we do talk about drugs around them. Toddlers are demanding, they're determined. Substance use conversations around them start early. What if you live with a partner, or what if you are someone that uses edibles? Well, one thing that we have to talk about is the importance of keeping them out of reach of children and why that's important. And if you're using these substances, considering when is a safe time and an appropriate time to use, is that when you're supervising? Well, maybe not. You may be better off to use in a situation whereby you're not supervising, or your partner's supervising, or you know that that youth is in a safe space. Youth get a little older, they're fantasy driven, they're self-focused, they're emotional. They're going to ask you questions. Drug use conversations start this early too. Many of us have had colds the last couple of years. We've had flus, we've had COVID. These things have happened. We took cough medicines, we took cold medicines. These cough and cold medicines may have contained substances like codeine or dextromethorphan. Codeine's an opioid. Dextromethorphan acts like an opioid. These are not recommended for young children under the age of 6. So you may get your child a different cough medicine. You may have a 5-year-old ask, why can't I have that? Why do I use this? Why do you use that? So you point out the things that are better for them. We have cough medicine for children because it's safe for them. You keep the focus on them. You're having a substance use conversation there, but it's with a 5-year-old. It's very simple. You may even ask them things about what safety looks like. Again, you're now having a safety conversation with them. They're learning to ride a bike. We teach them about having a helmet. We teach them about learning to ride with training wheels. We teach them in ways that we're supporting them. We show them that we want them to learn, but we will always be there to help them. They get a little bit older. They like routine. They love family. They want to learn. They're going to start asking you other questions about substances. Things like, why do you drink coffee every day? Why do people drink beer? Why do they drink wine? Why do you drink at parties? Why does so-and-so drink at parties? You have honest conversations about these. You don't try to hide the conversation. You don't skitter it under the table, because then what you're doing is you're breaking some of that trust. You point out the importance of designating a driver. You point out the importance of safer consumption by setting limits. Now, some parents may say, well, if I model safer behavior, that a young person is more likely to model it too. We've actually seen research that questions that, or may refute that in some cases, but it's still important to have those conversations about why we do it. Ooh. Mel, I'd actually love to chat with you a little bit more about overdose, even after the presentation. We have another presentation that explores overdose in greater depth. I'd love to get into that conversation. But we know these conversations become more complicated as they get older. With information about thoughts or about tonight's webinar, I'm certainly more than happy to share some of that information. And again, a conversation about overdose is quite complicated, because by the time youth get to high school, even by the time they get to middle school, they may have seen this happen, or they may have experienced it themselves. Now what we talk about is risk. Now what we talk about is harm, especially when we get into heavier substances. Tonight we've been talking about cannabis, alcohol, tobacco, very commonly consumed, but quite risky. You may have other youth that want to have conversations about harder drugs. Things like cocaine, things like opioids, things like sedatives. Because you've started these conversations that I mentioned in the last slide, because you've built up conversations about safety, conversations about harm reduction, conversations about medication, conversations about prescriptions, and why, if they're using a prescription, for instance, they need to keep it out of reach of their peers. They don't share it with their friends. Why do they only take a certain amount? Now what you're doing is you're framing conversations about drug use just into everyday conversation. It helps reduce the stigma when the heavier conversations come along. You've been doing this for years. You're already professionals at it. But you're at a point that these conversations get more difficult. And as long as you can remember a lot of those skills we spoke about before, setting goals that are realistic. And if you don't know, being willing to look things up with them. We set the importance of listening, of asking questions, of asking their thoughts and feelings. What you're doing is you're cultivating trust. You may not be able to guarantee that no one in your life around you uses drugs. But what you can do is create a safe space where they can come and speak with you about them. And in that regard, you can stand to help them reduce the risk of using substances, yes, but using substances problematically as well. That's your role. You are their care providers. You are there to provide care. It's in the term. The way you do that is by keeping your support there, being willing to help in situations, avoiding judgment. And if they bring up something that's uncomfortable, you can point out that that makes you uncomfortable. That's okay. But point out the fact you still want to listen, you still want to understand. They trust you. They've always trusted you. You're here tonight because they trust you. You're here tonight because you want them to trust you. That in itself is an emotion you want to hold on to. And you can even show that through the language that you use. The youth brings up a point. Instead of telling them, but, consider other language. I got an A on my test. Well, that's great. But, next time maybe you should study a little more. You get an A+. Well, now you've completely disregarded their accomplishment. Maybe you have a kid that was vaping, or was smoking, or was drinking. And they say, hey, I didn't drink this weekend. They're 18 years old. I chose to be the DD. Well, that's great. But a couple of weeks ago, you got pretty smashed. You're completely disregarding a success that they've had. Celebrate those. Build on them. They make a point. Say and. Because when you do that, you're inviting more of a conversation and less of an argument. I got an A on my test. That's great. And I'm looking forward to seeing what else you can do. That's great. And how do you feel about it? That's great. And how do you want to celebrate? They were the DD. They've quit smoking. They've cut down on their vaping. I'm really happy to hear that. You express that emotion. And when you say and, you build off of it. You're inviting them to tell you more. Instead of saying should, telling youth what they should do. I've worked with thousands of kids over the years. I have presented to 25,000 of them in the last number of years. I can tell kids what they should do all day long. They might do it. Chances are they probably won't. Instead, I tell them what I'd like them to do. I'm expressing emotion. I care. I want you to do this because, or I would like you to do this because of this. It brings back the idea of agency and the agency of choice, but it also introduces the fact that you're doing it because you care. The next two words are very important when discussing substances. You want to avoid referring to drugs as bad and think of them as harmful. When you introduce the word bad, you're creating morality in the conversation. Drug use is not about morality. Previous existing abstinence programs made drug use about morality. And the problem was when a person started using drugs and we identified them as bad, that identified the person as bad, which made them uncomfortable talking about it, which made them less likely to come forward, which made them less likely to ask questions, and it made them more likely to suffer harms as a result of drug use because they never found support. Point out drugs are harmful. That's okay to do. It is not a lie. It's the truth. Alcohol, very harmful. Tobacco, very harmful. Cannabis can be quite harmful as well. If you call them bad and the person uses them, you're identifying them as bad. You want to keep them separate from the substance. Same thing with stupid. Stupid's a judgment call. If I say a drug is stupid or using drugs is stupid and someone does that, well, now I've just basically called them stupid. They're unhealthy. Consuming alcohol is unhealthy. There is no healthy consumption of alcohol. Does not exist. That's different than saying alcohol consumption is stupid. Next up, the idea of disapproval. We talk about concern. We feel disapproval because we're concerned. So get rid of the word disapproval. Cut out the middleman. You're concerned. I'm concerned about what happened here. I'm concerned about your decision. And we can talk about why that is. Now you can introduce the feelings and thoughts on it. Now you can introduce those safe consumption, or not safe consumption, but safe discussions, because you're focusing on safety in that regard. If you use the word disapprove, now you're insulting them. I think less of you because of this. They're still your kid. You still love them. They may not always be perfect. They're human. None of us are perfect. Point out concern. Same thing with disappointment. You point out worry. Does anyone have any questions? Anything I've missed? Well, the last thought I want to give you is this. How can I tell if a youth is using drugs? Oh, Kashmir, I see you have a question there. Got your hand up there. You should be able to go on mic, I think. Let me see. Yes. Oh, sorry. You have a question there, Kashmira?
Yes, my question is somebody is already into that. So how to start the conversation with those kind of the individual who
How
are
can we start?
already into the addiction? Because I do work with the parents, whose kids are already into the trouble or they are already into the substance use. How do we start the conversation on that point with the parents? Like they're
At,
already into it.
at that point, you almost feel like you're playing catch up, right? You feel like, well, like this conversation, instead of worrying that it should have happened a while ago, how do we catch up? It's a great question. The first thing you want to consider is the idea that your goal is still to empower and support them and remind them that it's never too late to begin that conversation. Even with substance use, especially those that have been using, whether they've experienced harm or not, in many cases, unfortunately, we know youth will experience harms as a result of substance use, especially those that begin use early on. So the way that we begin that conversation is still remembering the importance that we want to set goals in discussing with them their own experiences. And even in having those experiences, they may point out experiences that they had that were fun or were comical or were entertaining, but it also invites them to point out the times they've seen harm, the times they've experienced harm. And when you bring up those experiences, you can ask them how that felt, how that made them feel, what sort of changes have they made to try to avoid that happening again. And if they haven't, then you can invite that opportunity of how can we try to reduce harm? How can we reduce risk? What are some strategies we can consider for next time? Again, instead of passing judgment on things that have already been happening, it's helping them set goals to try to curb their consumption. And that may get them to quit, maybe. But really, what we want to do most importantly is sort of reduce their risk overall, which comes from reducing consumption, possibly to the point of abstinence, but that doesn't always happen. So you point out strategies for change and goals to sort of affect change. So for people that are already using, it helps to identify the experiences that they've had, positive and negative, and identify what those negative experiences may look like. And if they haven't had them, if someone else has had them, what are some signs those are coming? And what are some things that they've learned that may have contributed to a risk? Again, a big example of this is were they drinking when they used the drug? Were they using a drug when they were drinking? Well, then a conversation can be about, again, like we spoke about earlier, the importance of avoiding mixing. If it's something around impaired driving, then again, it's the importance of sober driving, because youth will remember the things that they've actually experienced themselves. And we can throw data and theory at them all that we want. But when you have real earnest conversations with them about their lives, that's going to have a more impactful or a greater impact on them than just sharing the knowledge. Having it is great for the interim and the beginning of the conversation to help with your confidence of knowing the things. That's why we share that information in the first half. But it's that idea of remembering to still remain compassionate, to still remain caring, and to still offer the services to them as though they haven't used before is no different than if they have been using, because it's never too late to have these conversations. And if they're approaching you, that in itself shows that they care enough that they're looking for support, even if they've been using 3 days, 6 months, 6 years.
All right, that sounds a little better for the parents. The another question I have is that they are at the aggressive point and where the parents can't control
Mhm.
how the conversation can be start. Because I have some intensive case where parents already died from this substance use
Mhm.
and their second generation or the third generation is into the same situation. So how parents can start the conversation with the youth?
Especially if it's a case that this is causing significant sort of suffering in the family, right? You mentioned even things like violence in that case, right? In a
Yes.
situation like that, one of the first things is really identifying the immediate harm or the immediate crisis. So again, I mentioned, I alluded to it really quickly, the idea of a comfortable setting and picking the time. Trying to have the conversations in a moment of strife or harm or violence or immediate danger isn't going to be the best time to have it. Because again, all that that's going to do is create the possibility of someone feeling judged, someone feeling stigmatized, then they get more defensive, then we see escalation happen very, very quickly. So one of the first things that I recommend goes back to what we spoke about, the idea of finding a comfortable space and picking those moments to have the conversation. And that may be if they're having a fight, or even if they start to feel like this is going to lead to argument. This is going to lead to disagreement. Being able to identify that early and saying, hey, you know what? We're getting a little bit heated about this right now. We're having a disagreement. I'm not here to fight with you about it. I'm just here to share the information. Let's chat about it later. And they may say, you know what, forget it. I don't want to talk about it right now. Then you come back to it. If you pressure them, it's the same thing as pressuring them about anything else, especially if they're prone to more emotional or violent outbursts. They're just going to push back. I always say there's no way to push someone closer to you. Like I always use that example. You cannot push someone to become closer to you. So you have to encourage them to have that conversation, sure. But again, when they're ready. If it's in the heat of the moment, that can often be the worst time to try to promote safety, because what you're trying to do in that moment is really de-escalate a situation. So we talk about this in education too, right? Like, when's the worst time for a teacher to have a conversation about a serious topic is when they're upset. Or in the professional world, it's the same thing. We don't want to do it when we're upset because we're more likely to fight about it. And if it's a family or a situation whereby the client is, more aggressive or there's a risk of violence, then again, we want to make sure that we're addressing that first. And when that situation is a little bit more safe, then we frame these conversations. I see you're on camera there, Chantel. Am I missing anything?
Well, I want to jump in. Well, thank you. It's already 7:32, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you so much, Steve, for a very rich, informative session. I still learned some stuff tonight. So hopefully everyone had a chance to get the information that you were seeking tonight. We would kindly ask you to scan the QR code on the screen that just left, Steve. Your last, we don't have the slides anymore.
Sorry,
so that's a quick survey just to help us. But at the same time, if by any chance you didn't get to ask a question and you wanted to, in the chat, we have an email that you can send us an email, but we also have a support hub, a chat line, a chat as well as a direct line. If you have any questions and need direct intervention, we would be happy to provide support. So once again, thank you, Steve, for a very rich session. And thank you, everybody, for coming tonight and participating. We hope to see you at our next one, which will be sometime in May. So look at your inbox, look at our email. We will be promoting it that then.